Right, informal chat, okay?
Okay. But you're leading, obviously, because
I will lead.
you will lead.
I will lead.
I will follow you.
Cool. Welcome to one of my favourite gardens in the whole wide world.
Wow.
It is Adam's garden, also known as Adam and the Arth. Some of you would have seen the video that I did a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, about maybe 2 years ago.
2 years ago. And it's one of the videos with the highest comments I've ever had. Really inspired by a story. So I thought today we'd have a little bit of an informal chat, like a bit of a revisit and see how things are going on with everything you're doing.
It's probably because I responded to most of them as well, to be fair.
You did. It's like, oh, if I respond to this, they might subscribe to you as well.
You know, it's worth a punt, isn't it?
Do you want to just, where can people find you firstly before we get into it?
Well, first of all, croeso, welcome to my garden. I garden primarily here in West Wales, but I also do a lot of school teaching as well, go around schools. But on social media, I'm Adam and Arad, which translates directly as Adam in the Garden. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. I'm scared of TikTok, but I'm giving it a go as well.
Yeah,
I am on TikTok. It's
terrifying.
It's just too condensed, and I could talk 2 hours about carrots, so it's, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so please head on over and give me a follow if you would as well.
So, 2022.
Yeah.
Tough season. What are your thoughts?
Very challenging, especially if you're new to gardening. There's been a lot, the rule book has been ripped up.
Yeah.
In terms of we've had...
back to square one.
Back to square one. We've had a very dry year. Most seasons have been very dry. June was very challenging personally for me. A lot of cold nights, and with that came, you know, slow growth. A lot of the plants in the garden weren't maturing as quickly as I hoped. We weren't putting roots down into the soil. So, you know, helping them to grow and develop further into the summer. Then we've had the heat waves of July, and we're into August, and we've got the heat waves of August. Yeah. So it's, as a Welsh gardener, we love rain. We moan about it all the time, but it's one of the best assets, and we're very fortunate. I know other parts of the country have been affected by severe drought, and we're not in that position yet. We've had a few days where we have had what we like to call wet rain in Wales, where it has properly soaked through the soil, but it's been a really challenging year. I think, you know, there's some things that ultimately will do well when you've got a hot, dry year. You know, anything in the tomato family, and your aubergines, your peppers, they're all doing brilliant.
Salads.
Well, yeah, my salads are Usain Bolt salads, because they just seem to be they're higher than my sunflowers, you know. And salads, in general, have been a tricky one. A lot of watering, and that's something I'm not good at, being a Welsh gardener, because it's something I take for granted.
It's true. It's true.
So I, you know, it's been a learning curve, hasn't it? I don't know about you. How have you seen it in Daneronnen and all your projects?
It's been tough. Apparently, I was reading it's the driest start to a year since 1935.
Wow.
The thing that I feel sorry for is all the new gardeners who started. A lot in response to the cost of living crisis, etc.
Exactly.
And then kind of having a slap in the face with one of the hardest seasons. It's probably one of the hardest seasons I've experienced easily.
Yeah, I agree, and I think coming out of 2021, I think that was last year. The spring was really difficult, and I was saying that last year, if you've managed to grow a successful crop this year,
you can do whatever.
Yes,
and now it's like
2022, and people are thinking, why are you gardening? Because it's the best thing in the world. Because actually, it's a learning curve, isn't it? And
I think some people argue that it'll only happen this year. We don't need to really do any changes. Are there any changes that you feel you're going to make in future seasons based on this? Because it seems to be a bit of a pattern.
One thing definitely I'm going to do, and it sounds like I'm a lazy gardener, but I'm going to weed less. I'm going to absolutely leave a lot of the you know, annual weeds in, wild cresses and whatever, because at the end of the day, they're creating a natural mulch and a barrier. They're feeding the soil, they're pulling up nutrients anyway, so they're helping, you know, the symbiotic relationship with the other plants in the beds is brilliant. Yeah. So I'm going to hoe less, because I've been, when we get hot weather in Wales like this, there's been a temptation and maybe a bit of a decision to pull out the garden hoe. Yeah. Oh yes, burn off those weeds and clear the beds. But actually, I think I'm going to allow natural mulches to form, obviously with reason. That, you know, if you've got bindweed or myrtle, you need to tackle pernicious weeds like that. But in general, I'm going to be weeding less. I think as well, I'm going to be planning how I sow better. I haven't sowed this year with mind of that a lot of my crops will be ready sooner. So I'm finding myself in a miniature hungry gap, a bit of a dearth in terms of food. at this time of year when it never normally is like this, because my bean crop hasn't quite started going yet, and they're a
So
staple.
it's starting.
They're starting, you know.
nearly there.
I speak to them every morning. They're getting the message.
They are.
The birds have also found out that they're there. I may also try different varieties of a similar crop. So, for example, I always grow romaine lettuce.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll try a different variety, like I think it's Laboites or Labioites, I can't remember the name. But I'll try experimenting a similar type lettuce, but I think it's a bit more drought resistant. So I'm going to be looking at what type of plants grow better in drought conditions. But one thing, Hugh, like you probably know, growing into a garden originally and stuff, is that, okay, we'll plan for the driest year on record next year and we'll have the wettest summer on record.
Yeah.
So it's about not reacting in a panic. Do you understand what I mean?
It's about trying to, I think, spread it out.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's a little bit more kind of finicky, but I think next year it will be a lot more succession planting of smaller amounts.
Yeah.
So hopefully at least one of those plantings will hit quite well, rather than sowing all of my carrots in one go, for example, and hoping that they'll do well.
Yeah.
It's actually trying to spread that out. Another thing that I'm actually considering is getting some shade cloth.
Okay.
So I can have an area where it's like this for like a few weeks. If it does happen, I can put a shade cloth over my salads and hopefully prolong them. The thing that saved me with being able to harvest fennel and celery this year is just chucking down grass clippings every week, just like, and now there's not really many grass clippings.
No, because you're not, exactly. That's a really good point, because I hadn't considered that. I tend to use like natural structures, but if you're starting a new plot, I'm really fortunate, like I said, we've got mature trees and hedgerow, which do create shade, but even though they're here, it's not enough.
Like, for example, in the polycrop, it got so hot and we forgot to open the doors one of the days, and the tops of the tomatoes just dried to a crisp.
Wow.
So I wonder if, actually, because I've seen people use shade cloths over like polytunnels or greenhouses, so I don't know.
I did that this year with the greenhouse. You know, the day we had the record-breaking temperatures, it was in the high 30s. I went and raided the airing cupboard for old bed sheets, and I pegged them, because it was obviously settled weather, so the ground, it wasn't windy. So Sarah, my wife, was probably wondering where half the pegs had gone and half the bed sheets, and I covered the green, and that was interesting experiment, because in the greenhouse where the sheet wasn't quite large enough, the back area, I put the thermometer there just to see, and it was, I think, 52, but in the shade it was 41, 42.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're talking a 10-degree difference, and that makes a huge difference when it comes to water retention and also plants' durability then to high humidity, because that's one problem we do suffer from in Wales, is high humidity.
Because we used to say like the heat in Wales, you feel it differently, unlike in Spain, because it's a humid heat. Rather than like a dry. The thing that I also remembered on the record-breaking day, I was following the temperatures and I was like, yes, just outside Aberystwyth, hottest recorded temperature in Wales, and then somewhere in Monmouthshire or something, then got it. I was like, no. But
it was
funny. I was like, come on, who's going to be the hottest? Yeah, go Aber.
What was it, 35 or something?
35.1.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
and the melting point of any Welshman is obviously 18.5, isn't it? So
that's funny, because they say my favourite temperature is 17 degrees Celsius.
I think one thing, I think in people in the UK in general, we like to have a good moan about the weather.
It's in our culture.
Yeah, and gardening, you won't get someone who could talk about the weather longer than a gardener, I don't think. No. But I think there is a serious point at hand as well. We have got to adapt our ways, but one of the good positive things of it is actually every gardener I've ever met or I've ever learned from or I've ever spoken to have always got a different technique or a different method of doing something. And there's never a day where we don't learn something. And I always try to stress when I go into schools and stuff, doesn't matter how long you've been gardening, what you're growing, if you're not learning something in the garden, something's wrong, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think for me, this year I've learned that actually we can't take our climate for granted in Wales. Our climate is changing quite quickly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can have one kind of template that will fix. We've got to be agile, and we've got to just change the way we do things and be ready to respond.
Yeah, I kind of got this, I don't think it's a real word, but it's like my favourite word at the moment, nimbility.
Nimbility, okay.
So it's like being nimble and light and flexible and adaptable, and my head is like, I need to build in nimbility to my garden plans.
How have you found the lack of rain in terms of like water source? Because I know you're off Natural Spring.
Both sites don't have any mains.
Yeah.
So I know there's been like hose pipe bans and stuff for people with mains. The main kitchen garden that's mostly on this channel is that is basically fed by a spring, but the last 3 months we've had to not use that because of my parents' house running out of water.
Drinking water, yeah.
Because I used to be, oh yeah, my garden is spring fed, you know. So we've just been using IBC tanks, and I'm really grateful for the top up that we had about 2 weeks ago with a bit of rain, and it managed to lift everything up. But at Danaronen we've got a pond, and we've got this. It's a solar pump.
Okay.
And it fills an IBC in about 20 minutes.
Wow.
So the pond is in complete shade for the whole day, which is great. So we can just pump up and use the IBC tank. We will do proper rainwater collection, but we only started in March.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
We'll work it out.
I'll be interested to see how that develops, because we live in quite a marshy area, so there's a lot of runoff when you do get wet weather, and it's about how you capture that. And I think it's about being the nimbility you spoke about.
I think the other thing is sacrifice. In order to have a successful garden, you've got to sacrifice. And a big discussion for people with small gardens is like, oh, I don't want a compost bin because it takes up space. I don't want water storage because it takes up space. But if you don't have that water storage and then there's a hose pipe ban, for example, you could lose all your crops. However, if you sacrifice a bit of space, but it allows you to actually have success in the garden, there's all these questions that you've just got to work out.
And that's a question for people with larger gardens as well, because I think in the last video I spoke about sacrificial planting and the idea of not even sacrificial planting, but sacrificing. The cockerel wanted to join in, but they always seem to know when a camera crew turns up, and they enjoy.
It reminds me of visiting Liz at By the Farm 1.0 and being heckled by turkeys.
We doesn't sound happy.
F-sharp.
In terms of sacrificing and larger gardens, one of the things I've done is allocate about a third of the beds for all kinds of pollinator-friendly flowers, like the calendulas, and they're also companion plants as well in terms of pest control. But actually, what I found is in a paper exercise, it looks like I'm losing 30% of my growing space, but what I've got remaining is far more productive, and the crop yields are greater.
Plus, you're creating a space that you want to come out and enjoy, because it's what I said, it looks like a potager garden. So if you enjoy it, you're going to come up and do more work anyway, which is going to lead to productivity.
Oh, absolutely, and it's about... I think everyone's garden reflects a bit of themselves, doesn't it? I've designed a garden where I can hide all the messy bits to the side.
I was about to say, I'm interested if, with it being drier, and it's a very topical thing that's fresh in our minds, what's the slug pressure been like?
Slug pressure has been interesting. At the beginning of the season with the cooler nights, it was a bit of a problem. Not so much so as in, I haven't lost any crops to slugs because we've got a strong ecosystem in the garden. We've got the wildlife pond and we've got the hedgerow, and we've got a lot of cover, which traditionally you would believe as well that's, Palus Royale for slugs. Yeah. However, it's also Palus Royale for hedgehogs, for frogs, for all kinds of predatory animals which will help reduce the population. Slugs haven't been so much of a problem. With the drier weather, what I'm finding is when I normally would do like an inspection in the evening with a head torch just to see what's happening, there are far less slugs about. But where I am finding the slugs is near, the shaded areas of the garden in the day. So I take it to cooler areas. But I've planted those purposely. So I've got, for example, the Jerusalem artichokes, the yakgon, the rhubarb, the cardoons. They're all to the periphery of the garden, to the perimeter then. Well, that's where the slugs tend to be at their most destructive. Well, those plants are far more resilient against them. So
that's clever.
Further in you get, that's where my salads are and my brassicas. Some people I've seen online have said that they've seen greater numbers of slugs taking cover under the foliage of their plants. But I don't know if that necessarily means they're getting greater damage. I don't know. What do you think is there a greater instances? What about you and Danaronen?
So far, touch wood. I'll touch 2 bits of wood.
Touch 2 bits of wood, you touch your share.
I'm like, is this wood? Doubting myself. It's been all right.
Yeah.
We haven't lost anything to slugs. There's been bits of damage, but then I'm like, could have that been a bird taking a peck? Like, I know, like sparrows sometimes quite like charred leaves or something like that. So
especially when they're young and tender. When I set up the garden here, and it was a new garden, so this wasn't cultivated at all, I thought that I was a bit of a whiz kid in terms of pest control and that everything was brilliant because I wasn't having any problems. The first 2 or 3 years, it was as if the natural ecosystem of the garden hadn't established. So I was seeing people reporting aphid problems and black fly and white and everything. And I was like, well,
You're like, yeah, because nothing found it yet.
yeah, nothing's found it. And I was like, everything's brilliant. I thought, you know, I don't know what's the fuss about. 4th year in, you know.
That's interesting, because the things that I read in, like a lot of permaculture, well, it says it takes 3 years to develop a pest-predator balance, but I don't think that does actually account for if you're creating a new space and it takes a bit of time for things to understand that you're there.
Exactly.
So maybe we shouldn't always follow.
No,
I've said that on my channel before, so
I think
I like you challenging me.
It's more in terms of.
Sleep well now.
It's more in terms of. I think it's about understanding that it's not just the balance, permaculture principles in terms of having the ecological balance in your garden, but it's actually about nature actually understanding that this exists and patterns develop. So I have found that things are getting a bit more what I was used to in my grandfather's garden growing up. Some of the common problems we come across, and that's, I think, because it was an established garden for over 20 years, whereas this is now in its 18, so we're now 4th year.
It's funny, it's easy to forget in like how young this garden is in a way, but it feels so full and developed. And you've created a new space. You've got, when I was walking up, you got this beautiful ornamental border.
Yeah, it was meant to be a cut flower garden, and then I got carried away with all kinds of herbaceous perennials.
Spoken like a true gardener.
And it was like, you know, I went to different gardens. I was in Algest, Wisley during the heat wave, trying to figure out how I'm going to bring back some eriniums in the boot when it was boiling hot, taking them into the hotel room and watering them, you know. But I've been collecting plants gradually, and I've been, you know, propagating plants, taking cuttings, basil cuttings and stuff, and I've created a border that was completely no dig, that I'm really, I really enjoy being there, and I didn't realise that I had such a love for seeing what colour combinations in the garden work well. Obviously, I think it's the year of the orange and purple in the garden centres and everywhere, okay? The colour combinations that are really working, so you're your Nepeta or your Nepeta and your calendulas, but I've kind of jazzed it up a bit and chucked in a few other things, like some traditional things like gladioli. I think gladioli are a plant that was undervalued. Always in our grandparents' gardens, we kind of forgot about them. Yeah. And I've put clusters of them in, and I've created this wonderful height. We've got some digitalis in there, or, you know, foxglove, but the cultivar then. It's full of pollinator, and it's interesting seeing the patterns, because most of my Welsh black honeybees that we've got in the apiary here, because that's obviously something that's changed as well since you were last year.
Got a lot of bees.
We've got a lot of bees here, but I'm finding a lot of solitary bees and bumblebees in the flower beds, but not so much of my bee colonies. They tend to be still pollinating, you know, native plants. So they're on the blackberry for a long time. They've been on the clover. They've been out in the fields. They're now on the Himalayan balsam, which is not technically native, but it's bringing a huge nectar flow in. And in Welsh, we call that Jack Neidiwr, which is an interesting name. It means Jack the Jumper. And the reason for that is because the seeds jump. Yeah. And that's how it spreads. Yeah, it is a problem. They pop, yeah. But, you know, I'm finding a lot of different solitary bees. And I've got, like, leaf-cutting bees cutting little notches out of my roses. That never happened before. But
that's quite cool.
Oh, I love it. It's brilliant. You know, I'll show you them in a minute. And it's just like, I don't know, adding an area just with flowers in is something I always wanted to do, just didn't prioritise because this feeds us as a family.
I was very inspired by seeing it. Yeah. My favourite thing one of my favourite things this year is growing buckwheat. And traditional kind of like buckwheat, if you buy as a cover crop, it has beautiful white flowers. Yeah. And it grows really fast as well. But it holds those flowers for a few weeks. Okay. And I'm growing this red type of buckwheat that's basically like pink, and it is so stunning.
So like I want crimson varieties.
Yeah, and I want to add that into some borders as well. I'm really curious, 2 years later down the line, what does self-sufficiency mean to you?
That's a really good question. Self-sufficiency is more than just food. It's about actually being happy with how you live your life as well, and not being dependent on external factors to make you happy. So for me, you said about creating a potager garden that's pretty and full of flowers. Well, I enjoy that. You know, I enjoy that as much as I enjoy seeing a cabbage forming a lovely heart. You know, it's like, I blush looking at a juicy cabbage. So I think self-sufficiency has changed in terms of I've realised that perhaps, you know, I don't feel as guilty about buying an onion or maybe buying a carrot that I know has been produced organically, locally. It's a cheap crop to produce, and it's something we produce well in this country. If I had to feed myself completely from this garden, I would be able to do so. It would mean that I would be living off Swiss chard and beans during the autumn, but then, you know, there's beautiful things you can create with that. What I need to improve on, and what we need to improve on, is experimenting with different dishes and how we can jazz up, you know, your bog standard beetroot, or your, well, that's unfair because beetroot is beautiful. But in terms of how...
I know what you mean, though.
Yeah, it's how do you turn it into something that you want to eat?
Boil it or roast it so many times.
Yeah, so I think self-sufficiency is an easy word to coin, is an easy phrase to coin. I'm self-sufficient, I live a self-sufficient life. But when you dig into it or delve into it deeper, what you actually understand of it is that it's about being happy in your self, in where you are in life. And your garden, for me, obviously, I said in my first video, it's where I escape. It's my little part of the world that I'm completely at ease with. Yeah. I'm not in control of it. You know, nature does what nature wants to do, is show me that this year.
Yeah, you have to, like...
I, you know, bow down to the natural authorities.
Yes, Mother Nature.
But I don't know, would you agree? What self-sufficiency mean to you? Is it like...
No, I agree. I think self-sufficiency as a definition, being the idea of self, is down to whatever you want it to be, with a common goal of feeding yourself and nourishment, not just of your like body, but also like the soul and your family, and enjoying time and nourishment with nourishing the local nature. Exactly. That's what I think. I think what works really well with self-sufficiency, which you kind of mentioned a bit with, like, if you're buying a local grown onion, that's kind of co-sufficiency, so community sufficiency. But yeah, I think self-sufficiency is a very individual thing.
One thing I'll openly admit, in terms of how I've cheated a bit in terms of seasonal eating, okay? Because I'm very stickler for, we do not buy veg in a supermarket, we don't, okay? So that means I've got to cut my nose off often when you fancy a strawberry. If it's not May onwards, it doesn't happen, you know, because we have strawberry jam. But one thing I do is, if I go out to a restaurant, then I'll have the meals that I can't possibly source from my garden. So I'll have, like, for example, I'll have a strawberry cheesecake, maybe...
In January?
No, not in January, in April perhaps, you know. January is a bit too early, but as in, I'll tend to always pick something on the menu that I can't, or that I haven't produced.
I've learned, I haven't heard of that before.
Well, I've learned to kind of cheat in that way, but I'm not cheating in terms of what I'm doing in the garden. I think we should actually be proud that there's a huge interest in gardening now. There's a huge generation of new gardeners coming in, experimenting, wanting to grow. So I think we should actually look back and say, you know, let's not beat ourselves up about the problems that we have in the garden, or even essentially our climate and how that creates challenges. Let's celebrate that so many people find excitement in the garden and joy. Because when I was a young boy, it wasn't seen as something you do. It was a bit of a dark kind of pastime you just do quietly without anyone knowing.
Don't admit it. The thing that I hate is about, God, it must be so much work. And I don't see it as work.
I've never been bored. That's one thing. I've never met a bored gardener. I don't think gardening allows you to be bored.
And if they are a bored gardener, they're not a gardener.
Exactly. That's the bold statement.
That's the best way to filter.
I could happily, for example, after a long day's work, doing something, working on a project in a school or whatever, come back 7 o'clock, I've had my supper, and you know, the cool nights are hitting in, especially in the end of August and stuff. I could kill 2 or 3 hours in the garden, and come from then, someone asks me, what have you done? I'd be like, well, something's happened in the midst of all that, but maybe actually what I've done is enjoyed. Yeah. That's what I've done. Can we squeeze a bit of Welsh in there?
You want to squeeze a bit of Welsh in?
Go on.
So beth ti'n mynd I wneud dros y gaeaf?
Dros y gaeaf, fi'n mynd I gynllunio lot mwy. Fi'n mynd I fod yn meddwl ble fi'n mynd I fod yn plannu pethau yn yr ardd. Nes I ddim cynllunio lot blwyddyn diwetha, es i'n brysur a anghofus i'r elfen bwysica.
A fe o'n i'n just meddwl, falle na I rhoi'r tatws fyna, a wedyn y moron job yna.
Gywir un peth. Mae'n edrych yn bed, mae'n gawl pot o bopeth.
Mae'n gweithio.
Ond mae'n gweithio. So dwi'n meddwl dwi'n mynd I fod yn fwy trefnus. Dwi'n gweud dwi'n mynd I fod yn fwy trefnus, gawn I weld y fe, ond dwi'n mynd I trial bod yn fwy trefnus. Dwi eisiau edrych mwy ar cyflenwyr. hadau pethau. Dwi eisiau gweld pa fath o gwmnïau sydd yn tyfu neu sydd ar un fath o ffordd o dyfu a fi. Dod i'n nabod mwy o arddwyr. Dwi ddim wedi bod yn dda iawn blwyddyn hyn Huw, am fynd i weld gerddi pobl. Mae'n bwysig wneud, ti'n mo?
Achos mae'n rhaid i ti rhoi mwy gymaint o ymdrech i dyfrio.
Ie, na beth yw e.
Dim amser i fynd allan. Sori.
Beth am bwyty ti? Beth yw ti'n meddwl?
Ie, mwy o blanio rwy'n credu. A ymlacio hefyd. Mae wedi bod blwyddyn brysur iawn gyda gwaith a rwy'n hapus iawn gyda fe. Ond jyst cael bach o amser i fy hunan a golygu fideo hyn.
Yn amlwg, cos yn y Gwanwyn mae hwn yn dod mas, ie?
Wel, rhywbryd.
Rhywbryd. Amlacio wedys ti, dwi'n gwybod.
Wel, ie, ond mae ymlacio i fi yn gweithio. Ond, ie, rwy'n jyst edrych ymlaen achos mae'r egni yn wahanol iawn. Rwy'n really hoffi nosweithion dywyll.
Ie, a fi. I ti'n teimlo fel, mae pobl yn gofyn i ti fel garddwr, pryd yw dy hoff amser di yn y flwyddyn, a dwi wastad fel y geia, a maen nhw fel, beth? Achos yn y haf mae popeth yn digwydd, ond dwi'n hoffi, am y reswm hynny, yr amser i jyst mynd...
Ie, wel mae gwyliau haf fi yn mis Ionawr.
Ie, gywir. So, mae mis Ionawr yn fis da am jyst cynllunio a neud stwff. Dwi wastad yn gweud hynny. A mis Rhagfyr yw probably yr unig mis yn y flwyddyn. Dwi bron yn neud dim byd yn y ardd, ti'n modd.
Na rwy'n jyst cerdded bant.
Ie, jyst gadael bod, ty fe. Ond so mae geia mynd i fod yn brysur ond braf.
Ydy, edrych ymlaen.
Ie, a fi fydd.
A big thank you to Gardena for supporting the Inspiring Garden series.